Have you ever noticed how night on screen can be so many different things? I was recently watching The Last of Us, and in episode 5 I got to this scene. Now mind you, I hadn't played the game, so at this point in my mind, anything could happen. I was on the edge of my seat until this line from Sam. It hadn't even occurred to me that there were no practicals in this scene. In fact, we don't get any until Rebel vehicles arrive, nearly a whole 5 minutes later.
There's cars everywhere.
Why do you think you're in front? Clear them.
For a show that's look is grounded in realism, it can be hard to create naturalistic lighting when your only justification is the moon.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge on any movie in which you're dealing with a natural environment with no lighting source. Is night. Like you say, you're not going to put a bunch of Muscos up there. That wouldn't look right. I mean, you could, but it's going to have a fundamentally different look.
Of course, there are plenty of films with scenes that play out under the ambience of moonlight, but it can be hard to make this look realistic. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes realism isn't the goal.
It's kind of fake, the idea of moonlight. I mean, you go out on a moonlit night, that's not what you imagine it looks like. The thing is with lighting, you're not always trying to completely represent reality. But for me anyway, I want to put the audience in a world that they believe, that appears like it behaves the way the real world does to their eyes. The light behaves the way it does in the real world.
The Last of Us required a grounded aesthetic in order to suspend disbelief and make its world feel real. Eben Bolter, director of photography for this episode, as well as episodes 3 and 4, described the show's look as follows.
I mean, to me, the world of The Last of Us, the world itself is so cinematic. The situation is so cinematic that the visuals shouldn't be slick Hollywood, James Cameron cinematic, let's say, because in my view, that's putting a layer of slickness and cinema on top of an already slick and cinematic world. And it can start to sort of break the illusion and suspension of disbelief. And I felt that The Last of Us, what kind of makes it different is the kind of grounded, gritty, vérité reality. So handheld camera, more naturalistic lighting, that kind of slightly documentary feel of a cinematic world.
In addition to coverage in April's issue of ASC Magazine, Bolter has extensively broken down how he shot episodes 3, 4, and 5 on his Twitter page, so I strongly recommend you go check that out. It's these types of breakdowns, after all, that are invaluable to learning how things are done. In one tweet, he stated that this was easily the biggest challenge he's confronted so far in his career, creating 2,500 by 1,500 feet of naturalistic moonlight. Bolter's solution was to use a combination of soft ambient fill from above, along with stronger hits of backlight.
I will change his mind, trust me. This is how it goes. He's like, no, Ellie, never, ever, ever happening. And then I'm like,
The soft fill was achieved by using 4 cranes that each held a grid of 100 6-foot bicolor LED tubes suspended above the cul-de-sac set.
We're shooting nights in Calgary where the wind can get up to 70 miles per hour. So I can't use big balloons. So we actually had to kind of invent or come up with a lighting system that covered that huge expanse and was essentially 400 really small, skinny lights strung together.
For the backlight, he relied on RES360 sky panels rigged on cranes that circled the set. The truck crash introduced fire as another motivation for light. And this presented Bolter with a new challenge, namely the mixing of color sources. With the camera set to 3200 Kelvin and the moonlight sources set to 4000 Kelvin with a small amount of green added, the dilemma became how far to let the color contrast go between warm fire and cool moonlight without sliding into the Hollywood slickness Bolter wanted to avoid. To ensure the color separation between moonlight and fire was subtle, LED tubes and panels closer to camera were warmed up and set to produce a subtle fire effect, while farther off units were kept around 4000 Kelvin. Here you can see the overhead LEDs in action. Dinos, augmented with half CTO, were brought in on the ground just off camera to provide more throw and sharper shadows. You can see their effect in this scene where Henry surrenders to Kathleen. Notice the flicker effect in warm light in contrast to the airy sky panels, which provide a cooler edge light.
It ends the way it ends.
Bolter is also responsible for another notable night scene, this time the attack on Bill and Frank's house in episode 3. Interestingly, for this sequence, he ditched moonlight completely, stating,
And in that one, just for sort of variety, I had the ability to use fire. And so much of this show is going to be moonlight in the future that I really wanted to go big on the fire and use that as the sole source, really, for lighting the interior and the exterior, and do the absolute sort of minimum additional lighting to that possible. So absolute minimum moonlight, and then I had those lightning strikes to give me a little bit more depth. And you know, it's just a fun thing to play with, to press the button. So yeah, that was a fun one.
Stating in a Twitter post, "For the Raiders' attack, we shot a single continuous handheld shot, taking Frank downstairs, into the dining room, outside to Bill, then back inside. Lighting-wise, I wanted to use the fire instead of moonlight, and I requested special effects rain with lightning strikes to amplify the chaos." Even under the constraints of moonlight and firelight, it's more about evoking a similarity to the truth rather than an exact carbon copy. And it turns out even the most accomplished cinematographers get anxiety from this type of scene.
I think it was my first film in the United States. And in fact, actually, I recall having this conversation with you guys about that film because in the film, Let Me In, involved dark forests. And I said to Roger, I remember it was the first time I kind of got the realization that Roger was actually human and not a kind of a...
Very human.
Yeah. But I said to Roger, like, I've got this really, really stressful scene. There's no light. We're in the forest. It's dark. It's snow. I mean, what do I do? And you just went, oh no. I think you used the words, I always get the heebies when you read a script page.
Heebies, yeah. Well,
you know, night. I think that was the word you used. I was like, good.
That's cinematographers Greig, Fraser, and Roger Deakins in conversation about their fears surrounding night work. And this is coming from two stalwarts in their craft who are responsible for some of the most distinctive examples of night cinematography in modern film history. Most recently, Deakins' subtle yet striking work on Empire of Light, where he displays his unerring instinct for simple yet vivid lighting design. Or Fraser's latest work on 2022's The Batman, a gritty detective noir story taking place mostly in the shadowy recesses of Gotham at night. So how many ways are there to approach night exteriors?
There are so many different ways to shoot nighttime that it's a good question because like you can't just say, oh, it's night desert.
For Dune, Fraser had to come up with a strategy that allowed him to determine what type of night would best suit the film. In this case, Iraqi's vast desert at night. And Fraser faced a similar predicament to Bolter.
There's two different types of night. There's the night that takes place on the battle, the landing pad, as the place gets attacked.
Yeah.
And then there's night in the desert. So there's two different types of night. One that you can motivate with fire and explosions and burning palm trees. But then when they land in the middle of the desert, there's no motivation. We ended up sort of approaching that in a visual way of flat ambience. And so therefore we had to figure out ways to shoot that. So for the most part, we shot dusk and dawn and then graded it to look like nighttime.
Day for night and its close relatives dusk and dawn for night are techniques as old as movies themselves. But the technique is still quite common today.
The night scene is done day for night, and that required a lot of testing as well. Day for night is a cinema technique that goes way back to the early days of cinema, and it involves deliberately underexposing the camera so that the daytime looks like it's been shot at night. And it's an old cinema technique that we're winking at here a little bit.
What do I have to complain about? I live in a fishbowl, but anything I want is mine.
For Mank, David Fincher's story about the genesis of the 1941 classic Citizen Kane, cinematographer Eric Meiserschmidt used the technique for a sequence featuring a nighttime stroll on the grounds of Hearst Castle.
Sorry. It's really important the audience understand the scope of San Simeon and the kind of extreme acreage that Hearst had, and that, you know, they're walking through the zoo and they've got giraffes in the background and there's elephants and the monkey cage, and it's just like this unbelievably grand estate. And even if we could light this, we don't have the resources to light it to the scope we want the audience to appreciate.
Yeah.
And David said, well, let's just do the day for night thing. We can do day for night.
Nobody makes a monkey out of William Randolph Hearst.
Messerschmitt brings up the important consideration of scope. Day for night still remains one of the few practical ways to capture the expanse of a vast landscape. For The Last of Us, Bolter was able to conceal the rigging and cranes for his moonlight sources behind the periphery of the cul-de-sac set, which was further shrouded by a 40-foot-tall blackout screen used for later CG set extensions. But what if you have to light up the whole exterior of Hearst Castle and its sprawling grounds? Or where do you hide the stands in the open desert?
And you can get a light out in the desert to light an actor, that's fine, but what happens to the rest of the desert? Like, you need thousands upon thousands of lights to light the entire desert.
Day for night is necessary in circumstances where a location's sheer expanse precludes shooting night for night. It's the process that gives shape to the vast desert in Lawrence of Arabia, gives glimmer to the water's surface in the opening of Jaws, and more recently, to convey the immense terrain of the Agua Dulce Desert in Nope. For Nope, director Jordan Peele and cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema wanted to emulate how humans really see in the dark.
How can we do this? How can we simply photograph it the way that our eyes see it, or the way that we experience it? And
it's meant to feel like night the way you experience night.
Our eyes operate in a fundamentally different way depending on available light. During the day, cone cells within our eyes are mainly at work. This is known as photopic vision. But at night, rod cells take over. This visual system is known as scotopic vision. Essentially, the rods in your eyes, which don't perceive color, are working more than your cones, so you perceive the night as nearly monochromatic, with only a slight sensitivity to shorter wavelengths such as blue and green. This is why we typically think of the night as blue. Add to this the Purkinje effect, where, due to our eyes' spectral sensitivity shifting toward blue-green, warmer tones such as red appear darker. Essentially, under low luminance conditions, suddenly our perception of contrast is reversed. In emulating this effect, instead of using the traditional techniques for day for night, Hoytema crafted an entirely new method of capture.
We combined two cameras, from which one camera would capture infrared light and one camera would capture 70 millimeter film.
He chose to utilize two cameras at once, arranged so that each filmed the exact same image at any one moment. An Arri Alexa 65 filmed the narrow bandwidth of infrared light, which captured contrast that felt like nighttime. However, this footage was black and white, so a Panavision System 65mm film camera captured the grain and color information of the scene. When combined together, this led to an effect meant to emulate our own night vision. Another film that looked to capture the essence of night, albeit through a completely different process, was The Northman.
I cannot escape my fate.
We shot almost no day for night, even though it looks like day for night a lot of the time.
Barring a few landscape shots and the opening with the volcano, much of the film was shot night for night, which was due in part to Northern Ireland's largely overcast days.
But then shooting there was mostly miserable.
all the elements. We got it all.
The howling wind and the rain.
It's raining almost every scene. If you turn the camera around at the crew, like we're all completely covered in Gore-Tex.
And the weather kept changing. Up there, it's like it rains 1 minute, then it's super sunny, then it's overcast. But maybe that's been in some way helpful because it's supposed to be cold and dark and gray and miserable. Hopefully that's been, an advantage in a way.
From behind-the-scenes content, the overcast conditions the production faced are evident.
3, 2, 1, action!
This creates a soft, low-contrast look with no hard edge light or backlight. And furthermore, this low-contrast look can be almost impossible to counteract in wider shots because of the sheer amount of light it would take to register against the midday ambient levels. In low-contrast night was not a look cinematographer Jaron Blaschke wanted.
I'm someone who hasn't cracked soft light as a night, as a quality of light for night. So I don't buy it. Even our foggy scenes, I'm using sharp light, which doesn't make any sense. But for some reason, it just reads as night to me better. If everything's just sort of even and dim, it doesn't feel like night to me, even though it's logical. You go out in a cloudy night, that's what it looks like.
I think if we had more direct sunlight, like maybe some small beats, we probably would have done day for night, just so we didn't have to bother with like the rigmarole of the lighting setups. But we just didn't have that in Ireland,
This is the same path I walked with my father, and he with his.
Again, as with Hoytema, Blaschke looked to emulate scotopic vision.
You don't see color at night, right? You go from, cone vision to rod vision, which are cells in your eye that are more sensitive to light, but they don't see color. And furthermore, they don't see red light at all. So, you see blue and you see some green and that's it. So how do you do that? Well, I was shooting some tests for night, and just out of curiosity, I had the Lighthouse filter with us.
Among his tests, Blaschke happened to have the Lighthouse filter on hand from he and Egger's prior filmic collaboration on 2019's The Lighthouse. For this film, the filter created a look that emulated the orthochromatic emulsion popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Essentially, it filtered out longer wavelengths such as red from the color spectrum while remaining sensitive to blues and greens. And it turns out, on the Northman, this removal of red acted as a near-perfect stand-in for the shift in our visual acuity that happens at night.
But it's just something about, you're only using this narrow wavelength, this narrow band of wavelengths from like ultraviolet to beginning of green. And then when you desaturate that, it felt to me like stuff looks like, it feels like night vision to me, what my eyes see subjectively.
A modified version of the Lighthouse filter was made and aptly named the scotopic filter. Amleth's encounter with the Cirrus is the first in the film to show the filter's effect.
Even though your brother stole my eyes, I see you.
Notice how the scene has a desaturated, almost monochromatic, silvery sheen with a tonal contrast more indicative of night.
I am no one's brother.
It is not enough to be the man that never cries, Prince Amleth.
However, it was the mixed lighting scenes later in the film, with both moonlight and fire, where Blaschke's approach got really interesting.
And the other interesting thing was seeing color in black and white at the same time in the same frame.
Inspired by a trip to Mount Kilimanjaro, he looked to replicate the experience of cone and rod vision happening in tandem.
It was like almost a full moon. So we had moonlight, which all looked silvery and black and white. And then at these tents, the camp, that were all bursting with color. And I was seeing them at the same time.
He wanted to create pools of color prompted by firelight that fade into monochromatic blue tones as moonlight becomes the main source of illumination. The challenge was how to subtly filter warm tones out of the scene to indicate night vision without losing all the color information in the pools of firelight. Blaschke's solution was to filter the HMIs with a cyan gel, therefore eliminating all red from the moonlight source while allowing the fire to exist unaltered. At the same time, he used a cyan filter on camera, leaving any moonlight in the frame untouched, since you can't lose any more red from an already gelled source, while gently skewing the fire to be less red.
Oh, wait! Be gone!
Here again, like in episode 5 of The Last of Us, we have two different looks for night. One with motivation of fire, and the other with only the moon. The techniques and styles couldn't be more different, and yet the intention of each is the same. Ultimately, the whole goal of cinematography is to create visuals that support the story you are trying to tell. It is about what you want the audience to feel. It all comes back to honoring the tone of the piece. I think cinematographer Conrad Hall best summed up the infinite possibilities, stating, "Cinematography is just the language of storytelling. It's not academics, it's not literature, it's just pictures. Of course, it's a very complex language. The piano has only 88 keys, but just think about what they can do. Likewise, the few things that cinematographers have to work with can create nuances in the story that are infinite and just as complex as music." So what's your favorite example of night on screen?